Hello everyone, welcome to another video, and today we're going to start a new chapter, that is how do organisms reproduce from biology. So without wasting any more time, let's get started. So in this video we're going to talk about the asexual reproduction part. In our next video we'll move into the sexual reproduction part. So to start off, the question that arises is, do organisms create the exact copies of themselves? Now the answer is no, and the reason is, for every production of a new organism, means for giving birth to a new organism, we need to undergo DNA copying mechanism. That means DNA needs to double itself or copy itself into a new one, which will get transferred into the new organism. Now while copying the DNA, there are some differences that are created during DNA copying, and that is due to the error in DNA replication. By DNA replication I mean the formation of new DNA from the previous one. So what happens is, the DNA are two-stranded structures, and while DNA replication or DNA copying, these DNA they open up, and from these two strands, two new strands of DNA will develop, and the new strand that will grow here will be copying itself from the previous one, and a new strand here will grow, which will be copying itself from the older one. So now we have two strands of DNA, and one of these will move into two different cells. So this will be suppose the parent cell, and this will move into the new daughter cell, means the new generation cell. So while copying these, means the new DNA fragments that are formed, suppose this is the old one and this is the new one. From the old one, the new one is being copied. Now while copying, there are some errors that take place, and these errors are very common. In every time a cell goes under cell division, there is error in DNA copying. So due to this error in DNA copying, whatever features that the offspring gets will not be 100% similar to that or 100% identical to that of the parents. Now there are similarities obviously, because major part of the DNA stays the same, only a few changes take place, and these changes result in what we call variation. And now the question is, what is variation and why is it important? Now variation are the differences that we find in the next generation from the previous generation. So these differences are very important, and the reason is this helps in the survivability of a species. Now think of this situation. Suppose you have a pond or a lake where many species of fish are present. Now suddenly the temperature of the climate changes and the temperature of the water rises. Now if there is no variation, if all the fishes present on the lake are of the same type, identical type, then what will happen? If they cannot survive, if they don't have the ability to survive at that temperature, all the fishes will die. But if there is variation, that means that the fishes will be similar, but they will not be identical. So some of them may have the ability to develop a skill or to develop a character that will help them to survive that higher temperature. As a result of that, a part of the population will die, but some part will survive and they can continue the species. So that is why variation is extremely important in case of reproduction. So that is all about whether we create exact copies or the fact that there is variation. What is the importance of variation? Now let's move on to the different types of reproduction. There are two types of reproduction. One is the asexual reproduction and the other is the sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, there is only one parent involved. We don't need two parents to come together, give their germ cells or the gametes and then form a zygote. In case of asexual reproduction, only one parent is required, and that single parent will create its own copies. Whereas in case of sexual reproduction, we need two parents. Both the parents will give their gametes. The gametes will fuse together, means they will combine together to form a new cell called the zygote. This zygote will later develop into a new offspring. So asexual reproduction is a much simpler process compared to sexual reproduction, which is a much complex process. And generally sexual reproduction takes place in higher animals, and asexual reproduction it takes place in case of lower animals, in unicellular organisms, or maybe in certain multicellular organisms, but of lower order. By lower order, I mean where there is not much complexity in their body structure. If I say higher order organisms, means there is a higher complexity in their body structure, in the organization of the body, having different organs for different functions and like that. So now let us see what are the types of asexual reproduction. So the first one that comes onto the list is the fission. Now fission is the process, by the word fission we mean to break down. Fission means breaking down, and that is exactly what happens. Suppose take the case of an amoeba. So what happens in case of amoeba? Suppose this is an amoeba with no exact shape. What they will do, they undergo the process of fission and they will break their cell into two. They will divide it into two. So for division, the first thing that takes place, and you should remember that in case of any cell division, first the nucleus divides and then the cytoplasm will divide. So what happens here, the nucleus will form a constriction like this at the center of the cell, then the nucleus will divide into two. After the nucleus divides into two, the cytoplasm will start to show a constriction, and after this constriction the cell will divide here, it will break here, and we will get two new cells which are actually the daughter cells. We call the new offspring cells as the daughter cells. This is the parent cell. So from one parent cell we get two daughter cells. That is the simple process of fission. Now this is a case where from one organism from one cell we get two cells. So it is called a binary fission, B-I-N-A-R-Y, binary, bi means two. So two cells we develop from a single one. Now there are some cases in which you get multiple fission. By multiple fission means from one single cell you can develop multiple number of cells, more than two. Like for example in Plasmodium, the organism that causes malaria, what happens, they have a single cell, and this single cell during their division they will create a wall outside them just for protection during cell division, and this single nucleus will develop into multiple nucleus, and each nucleus will then have a cell around them. So as a result we get multiple cells simultaneously produced inside a single cell. So this is called a multiple fission. The earlier one was binary, this is called the multiple fission. Very simple process. Here also the same thing will happen. The nucleus will divide first into multiple nuclei, and then the cells will grow around them. This is cytoplasm will divide after that. So this is all about fission, breaking of one cell into two or more cells is called fission. The next part we have are I will talk about two types of reproduction at the same time, because they are basically the same thing with a single difference in them, and they are the fragmentation and regeneration. Fragmentation and regeneration. Now, what are these? Fragmentation and regeneration. In both these cases, what you will observe is, if you cut any part of the body of an organism, that part of the body will grow into a new organism. As for example, suppose you cut the tail of an organism. Suppose, just an abrupt example, a random example. Don't take it as to be very specific. Just a random example. Suppose you take an organism, cut its tail off. If you cut the tail, what you will observe in case of fragmentation and regeneration, the tail itself will grow into a new organism. Okay, so it's not like the case of lizard. In lizard, what happens, if you cut off the tail, it will grow a new tail. It does not grow a new organism from the tail. But if the case is so that if you cut the tail and from the tail a new organism develops, that will be what we call fragmentation and regeneration. Okay, now both these have the same outcome. Means if you cut any part of the body, if you cut the body into multiple parts, each part will develop into new organism. Like if you cut an organism into 5 parts, these 5 parts will develop into 5 new organisms. Now what is the difference then between fragmentation and regeneration? The difference is in which type of cell actually does this. In case of fragmentation, we have non-specialized cells, non-specialized, and in case of regeneration, we have specialized cells. Specialized cells and non-specialized cells. Now what do you mean by specialized and non-specialized cells? Now whenever an organism is born, suppose in case of sexual reproduction, just take an example, we have an embryo that is formed after the formation of zygote. Now when that embryo has the ability to grow into a full organism, means all the cells present in the embryo have the ability to form any organ of the body. That means they are not specialized, they are general type of cells. You can take an analogy of, now you are reading in school, you are a general student, you are studying every single subject. When you move into higher secondary, you take a single stream. So when you take that stream, you get a little bit specialized, then you go for your graduation, your masters, your PhD and all, and the longer you move into the academic line, you get more and more specialized. In the same way, by step, the cells also become specialized. Like in the embryo, each cell is able to develop into any organ of the body. After that, they develop into different layers of cell. and these layers will have specific functions to form organs of different parts of the body. Then these layers, the cells in the layer will get a particular duty that okay, these group of cells will form the heart, these group of cells will form the lungs, these will form the brain, these will form the kidney, and so on. So ultimately they get a specific function that they need to perform. Whenever a cell gets a specific function that they need to perform, they are called specialized cells, means they are specialized in doing that. Before that, they remain unspecialized or non-specialized cells. So in case of unicellular organisms or lower organisms, generally the cells that they have are non-specialized cells, because in case of unicellular organism there is only one cell and it can do everything. So if you cut that, it will again grow into a new organism. Whenever that happens, if the cells present in the organism are non-specialized, they will be, that process of reproduction will be called fragmentation. Means if you cut a body and it develops into a new organism, that will be called fragmentation. Now if the cells are specialized, for example in case of planaria, they have some specialized cells in their body. Now if any organism which has a specialized cell, which has different specialized cells in their body, and still they have the ability to grow into a new organism from a cut part of the body, those processes are called regeneration. Now there is another difference. The difference is, in case of fragmentation, what happens, for example in Spirogyra you will see fragmentation. Now what happens there, when Spirogyra develops, becomes matured, it automatically breaks down into different parts and each part develops into a new organism. So that is a pure form of reproduction, a classic example of reproduction. But in case of regeneration, it is not a perfect example of reproduction actually. It is you can say it is a way of surviving. And why do I say that? They require to be cut. They cut themselves automatically, they divide into different parts automatically, and each part develops into a new organism. That is the process by which they reproduce. In case of regeneration, what happens is, if it takes place in planaria, as I have given the example, you can see it in your book, the diagram is given. If you cut a planaria into two parts, then they have the ability to develop into a new organism from the cut part. But that is not their primary way of reproduction. They have their different way of reproduction. For example, planaria reproduces by Hydra. Hydra is an organism that has the ability to do regeneration as well as budding. So budding is the original or the primary way by which Hydra reproduces, but regeneration is a property that they have, a feature that they have, that even if you cut a Hydra into two parts, each part will develop into a new organism, but its primary mode of reproduction is actually budding. So that is the difference between fragmentation and regeneration. Fragmentation takes place with the help of non-specialized cells and regeneration takes place with the help of specialized cells. Now fragmentation is the primary reproductive process that certain organisms follow. Regeneration is not the primary, it is actually a secondary, you can say, secondary way of reproducing, not reproducing really, it is secondary way of survival. That if you cut, then they can develop, they have that ability. They don't have any other mode of reproduction. They only, like Spirogyra. Spirogyra only reproduces by fragmentation. That is their primary way. Okay, so I hope this is clear. These two very similar, yet with small differences, but significant differences. Then we move on to the next part, which is the budding. And you see that in case of yeast and Hydra, these sort of organisms, they undergo budding. So let me show you an example of a simple cell so that it is easier for you to understand. You can see the diagram of Hydra given in your book. You can relate to that after you see this. So suppose you have a cell. There is a nucleus. So what will happen, again the same thing happens, the nucleus first divides. So the nucleus will divide into two by the process, the previous process I showed you with the budding. In the same way the constriction will take place and the cell will divide into two parts. What happens after that, a part of the cell wall becomes, means the cell wall is gone and the cell membrane is exposed. Now cell membranes are elastic in nature. Okay, so what happens, the cytoplasm here will apply a force, a push sort of force on these walls. As a result, as these have become very vulnerable now, they have become stretchable because the cell membrane is out. Due to this push, the nucleus will come to this region and they will push the cell membrane. What happens now, means the cell membrane will be exposed only here. These parts will have their cell walls. Okay, so this part becomes very vulnerable. Now because of this push from the cytoplasm, they develop a bulge outside. This part will now start to bulge out. Okay, bulging takes place. Here is one nucleus, the original nucleus, and the new copy of the nucleus starts to move towards this. This later develops into what we call a bud. It's like a projection outside the body of the real body. Just from one of the ends of the body, you will get a projection. This projection will ultimately cut from here and we get two cells. This smaller cell will later develop into a larger cell and grow into a new organism. So this process is very much similar to fission. Just the thing is the mechanism is different. The process by which it takes place, the outcome is same. You have one organism, ultimately you get two daughter cells, but the mechanism is different. Here the cell wall will degenerate here, the cell membrane will form a bulge, then it will form a bud and then divide into two organisms. So the mechanism is different, the outcome is same in case of fission and budding. So this is our budding, and why it is called budding? Because it forms a structure like a bud while reproducing. So this is an example which you can see in the example for this is hydra. You can see it given in your book. There are yeast cells or fungus cells which undergo budding. That is another mode of asexual reproduction. Then we have vegetative propagation, and vegetative propagation means the sort of reproductions where we don't need the reproductive parts of the body. For example, in different plants we can see that they don't need any specific reproductive part to reproduce. Just for example, in case of flowers like rose, you can cut the stem, put the stem on the soil and it can grow into a new plant. So there you don't need a reproductive part like a stamen or a carpel, means pistil, anther, pollen grains and stigma. You don't need those. You can just use the stem to grow into a new organism. There are many other examples where plants use their roots to grow into a new organism. This happens something like this. Very interesting thing. Suppose there is a plant, the roots are here and the plant grows, whatever plant. What they do? They allow the roots to come and fall on another part. Wherever it falls, it will form the roots here and a new plant will develop at the top. Again it will jump, it will fall somewhere, means they will not jump, it will be actually going through the soil and then establishing itself at any one point. At that point again the roots will grow and the plant will grow here. So what happens here, they are reproducing with the help of their roots, not any other flowering part, or means not any other reproductive part. So whenever an organism does this, just for example you take the example of potato. A potato is not a reproductive part, but if you put the potato under the soil, it is a modified stem, it grows into a new plant. So that is how, by using different non-reproductive parts of the body, if an organism can reproduce, that is called vegetative propagation. And one example, very popular example, very famous example is that of bryophyllum given in your book. What happens in case of bryophyllum? In the leaf of the bryophyllum, small leaflets develop. Means small leaflets, tiny leaflets will develop at the different corners of the nodes of the leaf. These leaflets, when they fall onto the ground, wherever they will fall, from there a new plant will develop. So here what is happening? The plant is using its leaves to form new plants. So no reproductive part, rather the leaves to form new plants. So that is another beautiful way of reproduction. So these are the vegetative propagation of different plants or any other animal that use them. The last one is actually spore formation. Now spore formation takes place generally in fungus. Sorry. In fungus you will see plants are using spore formation for reproduction. Now spores are not seeds. Okay, these are different types of cells which have the ability to grow into a new organism. For example, in rhizopus, these spore form, these look like this. They have a stem and they have blob at the top, and this blob will contain many spores inside. Okay, so they will grow like this, have spores inside them. This sort of structure is called a blob on a stick. Blob on a stick. So what happens here? These coverings are actually very hard coverings. They will not break very easily. This is just to protect the spores inside. And when they will break, whenever they come in contact with any moist surface, suppose this breaks and falls on the ground, and the soil here is moist. So whenever this will come into contact, this part will dissolve and all the spores present inside will come out into the soil, and then from here a new blob will develop which will contain more spores. So that's how, this is an example in case of rhizopus. This rhizopus will grow itself or reproduce itself through spore formation. Spore is a special type of cell that has the ability to grow into a new organism. These are reproductive cells. These are not your any sort of gametes or anything. These are not even seeds, the seeds will grow into a new plant. These are spores. Its name is given as spores, which have the ability, just certain cells in certain organisms, not all the organisms have them. That's why I am telling you it happens in generally in fungus. So they have these spores in them which have the ability to grow into a new organism. So I hope you understood. Here we have studied about 6 different modes of asexual reproduction. We started with fission, we moved into fragmentation and regeneration, then we did budding, then we did vegetative propagation, and now we are talking about our now we talked about spore formation. So we have studied about 6 different modes, and these are all asexual reproduction. If you have noticed carefully, we did not need any second parent for this, only a single parent did the job of reproducing. Now asexual reproduction has variation as well, because they need to create copies of themselves. So whenever they create a copy, the nucleus divides. You saw that the nucleus will divide and form a new organism. So whenever the nucleus divides, there is DNA copying, and as there is DNA copying, the copying will not be 100% similar, and hence there will be variation. But in case of sexual reproduction, means why is sexual reproduction actually important? We'll talk about that in our next video, because there is more variation in sexual reproduction. So we'll talk about that in our next video. I hope you understood this one. If you have any queries, do ask me. You are free to ask me any question. So thank you everyone for watching, and until next time, cheers.